Hello, my name is Dr. Meryl Forse and I'm the Clinical Director here at Gateway Psychology. Gateway is a psychological service for children, young people and families. We're based in Stoke-on-Trent in the UK. I'm here today with Chanae, who is our trainee clinical psychologist.
Hello, I'm Chanae, so I'm in my final year and I'm doing my placement here at Gateway, and I hope to work with children and young people when I qualify next year.
So we're here today to talk about the festive season. Before we get started, Chanae, could you tell us what are your plans for the Christmas season?
So I'm going to split my time between my family and my partner. So in the morning I plan to have brunch with my brother. It's going to be like a Caribbean kind of breakfast style. And then in the evening I'm going to spend it with my partner and stepson. I'm going to do all the cooking.
Okay, great. That sounds really fabulous. Probably similar for us, minus the Caribbean bit, but really looking forward to spending time, a really quality time, gathering together as a family and being able to do things that we weren't able to do this time last year.
Yeah, fun time's important.
Yeah.
I guess whilst Christmas and other big holidays can be exciting for some, they can also be tricky for others. So in your experience, Meryl, can it be a bit difficult for children and young people at this time of year?
Yes, absolutely. These times of increased excitement and lots of activity can be especially difficult for children and young people generally, but especially if they've had a difficult start to life. We know that even exciting times and activities can be stressful for anybody. It's not just for the children. So some of the things that we all find really enjoyable about Christmas can be difficult. So, for example, things like decorations, lights, lots of loud music, even presents.
Yeah.
There's also things like changes to routine and maybe meeting with unfamiliar people, visiting new places, and these things can affect a child's ability to cope.
We will talk more about all of that in a moment, Meryl, but first, what kinds of behaviours might parents and carers see in their children at increased times of excitement, such as Christmas?
Of course, it's always the parents or the carers who will know their child best. They're the experts really on understanding their children and the behaviours that might be seen in them. However, we might see children struggling particularly with things like regulating their emotions. For example, we might see more frequent tantrums. Or perhaps children behaving as if they're much younger than their chronological age. Effectively, they could be really hyper or buzzing, struggling to contain their excitement. Parents or carers might also notice that the children are finding it more difficult to follow the rules or the expectations as well. They might struggle with sleep and eating. There might be changes in their sleep and eating routines and patterns. Some children might even struggle to accept gifts. They might be quite rejecting of Christmas as a whole and everything that goes with it. Parents might also find that their children are more clingy than usual and needing a lot more of their attention and support. I think these are just some of the examples of what you might see in children at these times of heightened excitement or changes to the usual routines.
Okay.
So if parents or carers notice any of these changes in behaviour, it's a good idea for them to be curious about what might be going on behind the behaviour. So we would advise parents and carers to just be mindful of thinking what might be going on for their children.
Thank you, Meryl. So it sounds like Christmas and other big holidays can be quite difficult for some children and young people. Can you explain a bit more about why that might be?
There are a lot of different reasons why Christmas might be a difficult time, or in fact other big holidays as well can be difficult for children. So every child is different and will have had different experiences. But there are also some common reasons why children might find these big events difficult. A key one is overexcitement. So for children who struggle with managing their emotions, the extra excitement and, activity around Christmas can be particularly hard to cope with. This can be especially tricky for children who have difficulties in a sensory level, because there's so many overstimulating things wherever you go, really. There's lights, there's loud music, there's smells, whether they're lovely smells, but crowds of people. There tends to actually just be an overload at Christmas of all sorts of things. So we tend to do things to excess around the festive season. So there may be more food, more sugar, perhaps a lack as well of routine and supervision, maybe more expectations of the child. Can be hard for any child, but particularly for a child who's had a difficult beginning in life. And yet those are the children who really need the structure and the routine more frequently. There are also a lot of expectations on children and young people around Christmas time. So, they may need to take part in school plays or, nativities or other big events. They may have to attend big days out with the family, or parties or pantomimes, or, all the things that come with Christmas and the festive season. Tends to be also an expectation that they'll be on their best behaviour at those times. This may not come from the parents or the carers themselves, but might be from perhaps the wider family system or the relatives, or perhaps from teachers. So it can be really hard, particularly when those children are struggling to manage those feelings and emotions. And Christmas isn't always a positive time either, both for children and for adults. Christmas might heighten feelings that somebody already has of missing a loved one, or maybe grief about not seeing certain family members at Christmas time. It can evoke painful memories as well, perhaps of past times, particularly if the child has had negative experiences, of Christmas in the past. Particularly for adopted children, there may even be a guilt or a feeling of guilt around spending time with their adoptive family. So things like what we call torn loyalties can become even more prevalent at those times, where the child might feel a bit torn between their birth family and then spending time and having a nice time with their adoptive family. And these feelings would be particularly heightened at these times, like Christmas and other sort of family-oriented festive times. Some children might also feel a sense of intense shame, which makes them look at themselves or see things generally through quite a grey lens, where they might feel, instead of the sort of a rosy lens, they feel they don't deserve good times, or maybe don't deserve nice presents, don't deserve those loving family experiences. So what we might then see, these intense feelings played out in big behaviours like rage or aggression.
That makes sense, and I think it would be really helpful for parents and carers to know how they can support their children and young people during the festive season. In the days or weeks leading up to a holiday or the Christmas period, what would you suggest that they can do to support their children or young people?
So a lot of families will do things like having an advent calendar in the lead up to Christmas. Well, if you're not saying, do away with the advent calendar, it's important to think that for some children this could be a bit anxiety provoking, and it really kind of increases the emotional build up for Christmas itself in that lead up. So we're not suggesting get rid of it, but it is a good idea perhaps for families to counterbalance that sort of excited anticipation with maybe also having daily planners or a timetable of the kind of things that might be in the calendar in the lead up to Christmas. So things like the nativities or the big days out, and then of course Christmas Day itself, or the big day. So we would suggest using lots of reminders, some forewarnings about what's coming and what's expected of the child, as well as planning for what we call high-risk times, which are those times where the particular child is going to have especially more difficult times dealing with those moments of excitement or big expectations. So I guess we'd also be saying it's worth tweaking some of the traditions that are already in place. So we're also thinking here of things like writing to Santa. And of course there's nothing wrong with that. We're not saying that should be done away with either. But perhaps parents should consider about framing things less about the naughty and nice. For some children that might be tricky. Another example of similar vein is the elf on a shelf tradition. So especially if the idea is around the elf watching to see if the child is being good. This could put quite a lot more pressure and could be quite anxiety provoking for the child who is struggling to stick to the rules, and may in fact be quite counterproductive. So instead of the elf watching the child, maybe for families to just think about fun alternatives of what the elf could be doing. And I know a lot of families do that already, put the elf in, almost making the elf the one that's a little bit naughty. But be sure to emphasize that the elf is not going to be reporting back to Santa on the child's behaviours. So we'd say that if parents have other traditions that they are using in their own home, in their own family, it could be worth taking a step back just to think about how those might be interpreted by the child. And if needed, to perhaps tweak them to, just to be sure that they aren't contributing to further anxiety or dysregulation for the child. It's also a good time to introduce new traditions that are perhaps unique to a family. Because family traditions can really be a good way of helping the child to have that sense of belonging.
I guess a lot of these Christmas traditions that you spoke about, Meryl, are often incorporated outside of the home, like school, for example. So what can parents and carers do for their children to kind of reduce stress in those situations?
Yes, definitely. Schools or clubs often bring in Christmas-themed activities. And we're not suggesting that they stop doing those Christmassy things. They really are important traditions. However, parents and carers might want to connect with the school or the club ahead of time to advise them about the potential hot buttons or tricky areas that their child might particularly have. For example, some schools might make Christmas cards for mum and dad. So this could be really hard for a child who's in the foster care system. Again, schools might bring in the naughty and nice element in behavioural management strategies, which may be unhelpful for the child who really struggles with experiencing shame. So, we'd suggest that parents or carers reach out to the child's teacher or to the school or the club ahead of time to talk about what they've got planned in terms of festivities, and maybe to help them think about alternatives if the parent is concerned about any of the activities that are on schedule. So, the parents or carers might also want to explain to the teacher or to the school that the child might be experiencing difficulties around the festive season, and to prepare them that actually there might even be an escalation in behaviour during that time. So another important thing to think about in the build-up to Christmas is for the parents and carers, in fact any of us, to keep our own calm. It can be really hard to keep perspective when there's so much pressure from all around us, from the media, from shops, from family, from social media, about having that perfect Christmas. So part of that is building into one's own schedule, and I'm speaking to myself here and probably to you as well, Chanae, to make sure that there's time for relaxation, and this might be just a few moments of doing some deep breathing or maybe having a festive coffee.
I agree that there can be kind of a lot of pressure to have the perfect day. What would your advice be for parents or carers if their child is finding kind of the festive period difficult? Do you think they might need to adjust their plans?
Yeah, definitely, absolutely. Reducing stress is really important, both for the children and for the adults. If a child is struggling to cope, it may be worth considering or reconsidering the holiday plans. So parents or carers might want to just plan in some smaller events rather than a jam-packed social calendar with lots of big events. Saying no is allowed. It really is, and I think sometimes it can feel a lot of pressure to keep saying yes to invitations and to doing things, and sometimes saying no is needed. It's important for parents and for carers to be mindful of the overstimulation that that is present in many of these big festivities and events. Things like, parties or Christmas markets, even shopping centres. There's a lot of very sensory things in those moments, isn't there, in those places. So, lots of lights, sometimes lots of flashing lights. There's loud music, it may be very cheerful and festive, but it's loud, and a lot of crowds. Yeah. So, all of these things and the smells, everything else can be quite difficult to cope with, particularly for some children. So parents and carers may want to potentially limit or even avoid some of those situations.
And what about the day itself? Because there can be a lot of potential difficulties that can build up to Christmas, and there can also be a lot of pressure on the day as well. Plus there can be a lot more going on in terms of presents, food and excitement. Kind of, what do you think is the best way to support a child or young person who might be finding this time difficult?
Well, first of all, I think it's important that parents will make sure that they've prepared the child for what to expect and what the plan is for Christmas Day or whatever festivity it is for that day itself. For example, might need to say to the child in advance, we'll be getting up at 7 o'clock. You'll need to stay in bed until then, and maybe provide them with some activities to do, to amuse them whilst they're in bed. It might be the Christmas stocking or something like that. But if the child struggles to stick to those plans, so not going down into the lounge and ripping all the presents open or, that sort of thing, it might be important for parents to think about ways that they can support the child to stick to the boundaries. So they might need to then lock off the lounge and maybe even put a sort of out of bounds sign. Make it a bit fun, but still put some boundaries in place that will help the child to stick to the plan. They might need that extra bit of support to stick to the expectations. It might also be important for parents to use a visual timetable for the day, which will outline what's expected and what's going to be happening next, what the plan is for the day. On that note, it's a good idea not to cram too much into the day as well, which could be tempting. And as far as possible to try and avoid getting into that trap of rushing from one relative to another relative to try and see everyone in the day. With that in mind, it might be important then for the parents or the carers to manage the relatives' expectations in this regard. So what you want to really do is plan the day so that the child will succeed and ultimately enjoy the day, because that's really what it's about, isn't it? So like we mentioned before, Christmas can be really overstimulating, and if the child is overexcited and maybe struggling to cope with the festivities, it might be worth the parent thinking ahead about a safe space that's away from all the overstimulation and excitement that the child can retreat to. It's not being sent to your room. This is about a safe place that the child can perhaps just go to be calmer. And if one's at home, it might be the bedroom or some other quieter space in the house. Or if one's going to be away at relatives for the Christmas season, it might be important to plan ahead, to think of a space that the child could go to in a sense just decompress and re-regulate again. It might also be important to plan in some quiet and rest times into the day as part of that plan for the day, which would be about helping the child to just regroup again and re-regulate. So the parent might want to incorporate some activities that help to do that. So, for example, some breathing exercises or taking the child for a quiet walk for a short period of time, or maybe even having a nap. So it's important to remember with this, though, that in helping the child to do this, it's important that the parent or carer is there with the child in this, that their presence is important to help the child to regulate in these moments.
Okay. Meryl, you mentioned a bit earlier about gifts and how some children might struggle with them. Can you explain a little bit more about that, please?
Okay, so let's set the scene. It's Christmas morning. There's a pile of presents under the tree. So as your child opens their gifts, they're not as excited or grateful as you'd hoped. Instead, they're jealous of their siblings' presents, they're complaining it's not the right present, it's not what they wanted, and they don't seem to care that you've spent months saving to buy, in fact, probably what they've asked for. They might even destroy their gifts or potentially other people's gifts. There could be a whole host of reactions that may be very different to what you'd hoped for and what you might have expected. What's important here to remember is that the stressed brain won't be rational. Even if the child actually likes the gift, or in fact it might even be exactly what they've asked for, in that moment they might just be really overwhelmed. And so it could be a culmination of the stress or the excitement of the whole festive build-up. And it might also be that some children who have experienced difficult early starts might feel they don't deserve good things, they don't deserve presents. So, they can end up with these reactions.
Okay, so what would we do to support these children who kind of are around gifts and feeling like they don't deserve these things?
Yeah. I think it's important to think ahead. Again, a lot of this is about preparation, isn't it? And about thinking ahead. So before Christmas, it's worth thinking carefully about what presents to buy and also how many. It might be important, in fact, I think it is important that the parents would coordinate with other relatives about what's being bought to maybe reduce difficulties that might occur on the day. And then on the day itself, an idea would be to stagger the gift giving and the gift opening. For example, you could open some gifts on Christmas Eve, maybe some first thing in the morning, and then some a little bit later in the day. Another idea would be to not put them all under the tree. That, if they're there all under the tree, maybe have been there for days, ready and waiting, the child is likely to want them all straight away. Maybe not just theirs, but everyone else's as well. So it goes back to how one prepares for Christmas Day itself and how one prepares the child for Christmas Day. Making sure the child knows what the plan is and how it's going to take place. Another thing that's important to think about is perhaps not putting too much focus on the child whilst they're unwrapping their present. So this, for example, everyone watching whilst the one person opens their gift, which could be a little bit too overwhelming for the child. And then, of course, if the planning and if all of these things have been put in place and the planning and the preparation has all been there, but it still goes belly up, then things like empathy and co-regulation are really important. So what we mean here is perhaps for the parent or the carer to take the child to a calm and quiet place away from any potentially judgmental eyes of relatives who don't understand. They don't understand what's going on. Give plenty of empathy to the child, but keep boundaries in place and maybe put logical consequences in place where needed. If the child has destroyed all of their own presents, it's important to acknowledge that those are the child's belongings. Once they've been given to the child, they are their belongings. Whilst the parent might be upset, or grandma or auntie so-and-so might be upset, what is needed at that point is empathy for the fact that the toy is now broken. And it may have been something the child really wanted, but alongside that would be a boundary that toy isn't necessarily going to be replaced.
As well as difficulties around kind of gifts, children may struggle with the abundance of food that's around as well. Would you be able to explain a little bit more about that, please, Meryl?
Yeah, food is a really big part of Christmas, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Can actually be what most people look forward to the most.
I know I do.
So I guess we've got things like mince pies, turkey with all the trimmings, selection boxes, chocolate selection boxes, pigs in blankets, even sprouts. And these are foods and specific tastes that may not be experienced at other times of the year necessarily. So to expect a child to love and enjoy some of these foods, all the festive foods on offer, may be tricky. So I guess the other thing, which is what you were saying, is there's this often an overabundance of food, much more than other times of the year or other meals, and the child might also really struggle with this. So there could be different ways the child reacts to this. They might just eat too much, or they might hoard food, or sometimes they may not have the bodily sensation of reaching full and not know when to stop in that regard. On the other hand, this overabundance of food and the excitement that goes along with the festive season could mean that they lose their appetite. Perhaps not quite allied to that, but more about, perhaps just having too much food. You might have the example of, you start off the day and there's brunch at Auntie's house, and then you all go for mince pies to Uncle Jamie's house, and then you go finally for the main event, the main meal of the day at Grandma's house, and the child has just not got any more space. And of course, as a result, Grandma's offended, you're embarrassed, and the child throws a tantrum, and it's Happy Christmas, everyone. And I guess what we've talked about is true for any child, but for a child who has experienced early difficulties, particularly in relation to maybe not having enough food or inconsistent food, these issues around food can be even trickier. So research suggests also that memories are embedded particularly well through sensory experiences. Things like smells and textures and tastes. So thinking again of Christmas and food, these things will be particularly important when it comes to memories, and for some children perhaps difficult early memories. So Christmas foods in particular might evoke some quite difficult memories for children who've grown up perhaps in difficult and adverse early experiences. So it's important for parents and carers and wider family to bear these things in mind when the child might display behaviours that don't seem to be triggered by anything in particular or might seem really disproportionate. So to help a child cope with potential food difficulties around Christmas, one of the things parents and carers might do is to maybe limit the portions. And maybe supervise and manage food and eating meal times more closely. May want to avoid situations where the child has unlimited access to food, and in this I'm thinking particularly of sort of the Christmas buffet, where the child doesn't have, a particular specified portion. So parents might need to just supervise quite a bit more closely if needed in these sort of situations, and also might need to have a quiet word in advance with relatives or friends.
It sounds like there can be a lot then for parents and carers to navigate. So can we talk a little bit about when children or young people maybe won't follow the rules or have tantrums or aggression? What would you suggest that parents or carers can do in these situations?
Yeah, at times of heightened stress or excitement, absolutely, parents and carers are probably going to see more negative behaviours in their child or their young person. And I guess by this, we could see a variety of different things. So it's that difficulty following the rules. It might be, throwing toddler tantrums, regardless of what age they are. Maybe increased aggression, and this can be really because the child is struggling to cope with the change in routine, which, as you'd agree, there's usually a change in It may be about the different expectations of behaviour in certain situations, like maybe at a party or a big event or a family event. Or it might be to do with the child's difficulties at a sensory level, with all the overstimulation and the noise and the lights and everything. So I guess to answer your question as to what parents and carers can do, one of the ways would be to think about how they can reduce any additional stress over the Christmas period, given that there's going to be added stress, but to think about ways of taking away what they can in the way of stress. So like we've spoken of before, they can also be curious about what might be behind the child or the young person's behaviour. So, what could be triggering them in certain situations. And then they can find ways to reduce that stress or to reduce those triggers for their child. Of course, this isn't always easy or possible to do at times, particularly at times like Christmas. But using a lot of empathy is always going to be particularly important in these times. Some more practical things. It's a good idea to stick to the usual routines as far as possible. So the usual bedtimes or, whatever the home rules are, to not let them go by the board just because it's Christmas. And maybe sticking with the kind of family traditions that one would normally be doing in the course of daily life. So this will help the child or the young person to feel a sense of safety if those familiar things are still in place. It's important as well to keep to the usual boundaries and the expectations, making sure that those are really clear and also consistent for the child, and that the child clearly has those in mind. The parent might need to provide a bit of extra support to the child in keeping to those rules and boundaries, particularly at exciting times like Christmas. If the family are staying over perhaps at a relative's house, it'll be important perhaps to have a little conversation with the relative or the friend in advance so that that consistency of rules can be in place, so that the parent can explain their rules and their parenting approach to the friend or the relative. What we don't want is the child to get mixed messages about what's okay and what's not. And then, of course, if it's got to the point where the child is really dysregulated or struggling, the carer or the parent would probably need to, at that point, reach deeply into their therapeutic parenting toolkit for ways of managing the behaviours. So some of those tools will be things like putting logical consequences in place for behaviours, alongside giving a lot of empathy for what the child is feeling at that time. Maybe adding additional support as well that the child will need to manage. So if we're thinking about an example, the child has eaten the Christmas trifle on Christmas Eve. So a logical consequence might be that the child has to help to prepare another one, or potentially buy one out of their pocket money.
Thank you, Meryl. That is really great advice. And of course, this time of year can be really stressful for parents and carers too. So do you have any tips or advice for them as well?
Absolutely. As you say, it's absolutely important for parents and carers to take care of themselves all the time, but even more so at times of increased stress, like Christmas. Taking time out for self-care might seem quite an impossible thing to do when there's so much to do, 101 things to kind of organise in the lead up to Christmas, but we think it's absolutely essential. If time is really tight, it could be as simple as doing some breathing exercises. So, in fact, let's try one now. So it's that idea of, sitting comfortably and breathing in deeply, kind of holding it for a little bit, and then breathing out so that all the air gets expelled. Yeah. So it might be that, which can just take a few seconds and just be really calming. But other small self-care activities could be taking a moment to enjoy a festive coffee, or having a phone call with a good friend, or perhaps just listening to one's favourite music. when there doesn't seem to be enough time for that self-care, it really is important not to try and schedule in the big self-care events, like maybe a spa day or something. In fact, remembering to, taking care of yourself is also about saying no to big events. And it might be saying no to some of the plans or events that relatives or friends have invited you to. And those might just be causing extra stress just because it's too busy, or it may be something that you feel you have to go to rather than you want to go to it. And I think it's also important to remember to plan for what we'd call high-risk times. And those are the times when you know that you are going to be more stressed, or the child might be more stressed at those times as well. So that could be the excitement of Christmas morning, or it might be a particular family party. So those moments where, and I think again, we're back to the thing of parents and carers are the experts on their child and what they know is going to be hard for their child to cope with. So thinking ahead to some of those things. Also important to think about what can be done in the moment to take care of oneself, and maybe have a plan of action in place if needed, whether that's to have some time out to just re-calm oneself again, or having I suppose you could call it an escape route from the overexcitement. At those times, one's support system is really, really important, particularly at times of additional stress. So we would suggest that parents and carers educate their relatives and friends about what they need from them at those times, or even just to let them know that things might be a bit more difficult at those times. So having a trusted friend or a family member that the person can offload to is important and can be really helpful when things are tough. And particularly if that person is someone who can provide empathy for the parent or the carer. If one has access to professional support, whether that's consultations maybe with a psychologist or any other sort of therapeutic support, those may be a good place for the parent or the carer to talk about some of the additional stresses and the impact on them at these times of additional difficulty. This can be really helpful in terms of how the person can support their child or also help themselves. I guess in line with some of this, it's important to then also acknowledge that the parent or the carer might have had a vision of what that perfect Christmas was going to be like. The thing they'd hoped to create for their family, what they'd really wanted to give to their child in terms of a lovely Christmas and family experience. So it can be really hard then when it doesn't work out, or when maybe the parent or the carer has sacrificed a lot to get to that point, but then actually, have not been able to do what might have been. And that sense of having to just give that dream away, because they might have to support their child by not having all the decorations up or by not visiting a particular family member. So, it's a bit of a grief experience in some ways. So it's important that the parent or the carer is able to take time to acknowledge that disappointment or all the other difficulties that they've experienced around Christmas. It's all right to feel sad about these things and, feel sad about not being able to do everything that they'd hoped to do and wanted to do. As I say, whether it's limiting time at a family party or not staying over at relatives or maybe even not being able to put up all the decorations one wanted to.
Definitely, I think it's very important for parents and carers to take care of themselves, especially at times of heightened stress, as you spoke about. Before we finish this video, I wondered if you had any final tips or advice that you can share with parents and carers to help their children through this stressful time or over the festive period.
Yes, I think, as you say, Christmas and other significant holidays can be especially tricky for parents to navigate. The tips and the ideas we've talked about so far are applicable to parents and carers of all children, but even more so for those children who've experienced adversity or really difficult early lives. I think the key overall is to be mindful or aware that the festive season could cause additional stress and also cause additional difficulty for both the child and the parents. So I guess the take-home message is plan and prepare for as much as you can, and also use plenty of empathy to help the child to manage those difficult feelings. For those parents who have experience in therapeutic parenting or the Dan Hughes PACE approach, which is playfulness, acceptance, curiosity and empathy, it may be worth keeping those concepts at the forefront of their minds, particularly throughout the festive season. If any of the parents or carers have attended our Trust or eTrust courses, we'd say dust off those manuals and remind yourselves of the strategies, particularly during those high-risk times. If anyone is really struggling, we would say don't hesitate to reach out for additional support for you and for your family. And to add to that, there's no shame and there's no weakness in asking for help and support and admitting that you or your child need that little bit extra help and support.
Thank you, Meryl, for your wonderful advice and tips that you've given us today, and hopefully you all would have found this really useful. For more updates, please check out our Facebook page or our website.
From all of us at Gateway, we wish you all the best for the festive season, and thank you.